Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. Today we have the privilege of talking to Imche Fourie, who is the Chief Executive at LevelTwo. Now, LevelTwo is the birthplace of New Zealand's two only deep tech unicorns, Rocket Lab and LanzaTech. So a real privilege to have Imche on the show and to hear a little bit about the story of LevelTwo and the next part of LevelTwo's journey with partnering with Icehouse Ventures. Welcome along to the show.
Thank you very much, Paul. Appreciate it.
So maybe we can start at the beginning. You can give us a little bit of a breakdown on how LevelTwo came about, and this incredible history with Rocket Lab and LanzaTech, both businesses that have grown to $1 billion plus valuations, and where things are now.
Yeah, we've got a long history of technology development in the site that now is LevelTwo.
Yeah.
The whole building used to be owned by a government research agency, and then as the agency shrunk its operations over the years, some of the spare space on the lower floors were rented out to the entrepreneurial scientists or the spin-outs, and the cluster of startups that then started growing there was very organic, attracted by the prospect of cheap lab and workshop space, really. That's typically how startup clusters start. And yes, it started with Pete and Sean tinkering in the basement of LevelTwo, then other people joining them on their own journeys, or starting up their own things alongside that. And that ethos of just doing what you need to do to get your idea off the ground is one that we still support quite significantly today.
Yeah.
The first private company on site was founded back in '94, which was then BioDiscovery. Sean Simpson and Richard Forster then asked Peter Wigley, the founder of BioDiscovery, if he could borrow some lab space and get a little bit of investment capital. Peter agreed to back Sean's crazy idea, and that's kind of how LanzaTech was born. Matt Rowe, now the co-founder and director of LevelTwo, was employee number one at LanzaTech, so he's got a long history with the site.
Wow, that's really cool. So where are you based, and what sort of startups and entities are you attracting today?
Yeah, so it's we're in Parnell, in Lower Parnell, just across the road from Icehouse Ventures, actually. Which is a really useful place to be for a technology startup. It's not CBD prices, it's just outside of that, but still close enough to your research partners or your service providers. That organic cluster that grew up in the early 2000s is now a cluster of 20 companies on site under the LevelTwo banner, with about 150 people working across them. So it's quite a vibrant community of tech founders, people who've been there, done that, technical experts and scientists, and now quite a vibrant investor network as well. So it's quite an interesting space to be, especially given that we've got a very curated mix of very early stage startups who maybe just have an idea and need some space, sitting right next to companies like Avatana, who've been running for 5 or 6 years and are onto their and are quite far along their journey. So seeing those two those kinds of companies mix and learn from one another is actually quite valuable.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for building hubs and ecosystems where one individual or entity can learn from another, and of course when we look at New Zealand's growth, from a technology perspective, we really have come a long way in a reasonably short space of time, and we're at that point now where we see our tech exports growing to the point where it's been predicted that technology could easily be our top export earner.
Which is very exciting. That's I think what we're all aiming for.
3 or 4 years or so, and of course COVID actually shakes that up and potentially could accelerate that for us. And with the big hit on tourism, of course, it becomes even more important for New Zealand's success that we do really focus on those things that have great growth potential, right?
Exactly. No, this transition away from primary industries into something that's technology focused, scalable, and really has global impact is something that I think we've been working towards for a long time now. We've seen that accelerate in the last, I'd say, 5 years, which is an exciting place to be.
Yeah. So, what's your background? How have you ended up in this exciting role? What are the things that led you to this point?
Yeah, it's a series of wildly unpredictable events, as these things tend to happen. My background's in biotechnology, and I started out my career at the Centre for Brain Research up at the University of Auckland. Loved the science, loved the research, hated being stuck in the lab. I would be in the lab not talking to anyone for like 10 hours a day and wasn't really where I found my happy place. But because of my technical background and my interest in early stage ventures, I didn't know that was what it was at the time. I then joined an investment committee that the university had put together, which was my first taste of early stage ideas. Loved it, joined an early stage VC for a while, and then was shoulder tapped by an old mentor of mine to come and join this crazy new venture that he wasn't sure was going to last 6 months, which then ended up being LevelTwo. So that was Dr. Will Barker, who's the co-founder of Mint Innovation, who you should definitely have on the show if you haven't yet.
Yeah, sounds good.
That was late 2017, 16. I can't quite remember now. And I've been there for the last 3 years. So it must be 2017 then.
That's great. Now, LevelTwo is described as the country's only commercial laboratory and workshop facility growing deep technology startups.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this term deep technology is not a usual term that we've heard every day. So can you break it down for us in terms of what you describe as deep technology and why that's so important to growing New Zealand's future?
Yeah, so deep technology describes ventures that are on the forefront of new industries. They're pushing technological frontiers, and they're companies that are based on significant scientific advances or engineering innovations. So it's the hard stuff, it's the chemistry and the robotics and the agri-tech and the artificial intelligence. It's quite broad, but it's the things that are building new industries. It's not the small iterations. It's not the business model innovations. It's not the SaaS companies. It's not consumer goods. It's the really frontier pushing technologies, often sometimes called frontier tech. So this is seen as a slightly different class of things to invest in as an investor, where software tends to have quick turnaround times and the marketing side of it is quite important. With deep technology, it's all about the tech. It's all about the science. How do you get this crazy idea from bench scale in a test tube to a $1 billion facility out in China? That process is why deep technology is capital intensive. It takes a lot of money to scale this kind of tech, and it has long timelines. So if you think about when LanzaTech was formed in the early 2000s and only now are at the stage where they're at, which is a fantastic journey, but it took them a decade and a half.
Yeah.
So deep technology is the hard stuff, tangible stuff, frontier pushing stuff, and stuff that's quite expensive and quite has a long journey.
Okay, so thinking about these frontier technologies, deep technology firms, from an investment perspective, how does that look? Because obviously this announcement this week is around your partnership with Icehouse Ventures. I'm sure people are somewhat curious. We hear about certainly in Silicon Valley, investments that are put into startups. There's a very, very high sort of failure rate, and then a small percentage that do incredibly well and become the unicorns, the $1 billion plus businesses. Now, for those that are interested in deep technologies, one aspect here is that the length of time, right? So if an individual or an entity invests, really they need to be in for the long haul in terms of actually getting a result, which to a degree is the case with probably most investments, right? The best outcomes tend to come after a longer period, and unless you're heading to the casino and expecting a return there, you may or may not get something, but it does happen quickly. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the risk levels, and how do you expect that to play out here in New Zealand, and how have things gone, sort of looking back a little bit historically?
Mm-hmm. So startup investment, regardless of what industry it's in, is one of the riskiest asset class you can be investing in, and that's sort of a given of startup investment. With some funds do have a mandate to make a return within 5 years' time, which makes software or marketing or consumer goods really attractive, because there is that fairly short horizon until you get your return. With deep technology, it takes a different kind of investor mindset, one that is comfortable with the long haul, one that is comfortable with the risk. Although I will argue that deep technology is less risky than software or consumer, because at each stage of the process, you have to de-risk your technology as you develop. You don't just give someone with a crazy idea and to turn bugs into ethanol, $700 million to invest in them. It's a little bit at a time, de-risking the process at every stage. So the hard work of de-risking the investment is the responsibility of the company that you're investing in. So I would argue that deep technology is less risky than some of the companies that New Zealand investors tend to favour, which is the software stuff. I think it's partly because a lot of individual high net worth people have made their money in software, so they feel comfortable investing in that area. We're now only starting to see the money made from deep technology come back into the country, and that expertise come back. Sean and Pete are great examples of that. Sean sits on the board of a couple of companies located within LevelTwo. Peter Beck sits on LevelTwo's board and is able to provide his experience and expertise to our companies. So now I'm really optimistic about what that next generation of deep technology companies are going to be doing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And are there any other good examples other than LanzaTech and Rocket Lab that would be interesting for people to know about? Yeah,
there are a lot of interesting deep tech companies waiting in the wings at the moment. I mentioned Mint Innovation earlier. They're one of the ones that have done so much great work in a relatively short amount of time. They were founded maybe 5 years ago now. So Mint Innovation takes, they extract gold and other precious metals from electronic waste, so old computers and cell phones. They crunch it all up, put it through a process, get some gold sequestering bacteria, put that in solution, and the bacteria actually suck up the gold out of their environment. Then they just scoop the gold bacteria off the top, and hey presto, you've got some pure gold. Fascinating process, but it's I think really world-changing stuff. It will completely reshape the way the e-waste recycling supply chain is set up, where now we have cities who generate a lot of electronic waste, developed cities, sending their e-waste off to developing countries who may not have the most ethical practices. Whereas if Mint Innovation builds plants in the city that generates that waste, that's a huge, huge benefit on a global scale. And this theme of generating value from waste is something that we've been seeing a bit more of recently. Avatana is another good example, about the same age, but they're taking waste steel slag and extracting titanium dioxide, aluminium gypsum and other raw materials from that with no waste, which is incredible. And for context, there's hundreds of millions of tons of the steel slag around the world that's just not worth anything. It's just lying around.
Yeah.
So that's a really good example. There's a company that I'm really excited about. That's still very early stage. That's actually part of a program that we've launched this year, where they're growing human insulin in plants. So that has the potential, of course, to disrupt the way that area of the pharmaceutical industry is set up. So deep technology is quite broad. It does stretch across agri-tech and med-tech and industrial chemistry. But it's the stuff that's really going to tackle the global problems that we're facing in a way that we haven't been able to tackle them in the past.
Yeah. Oh, that's exciting. So, tell us a little bit about the partnership with Icehouse Ventures. How does that change the game for Level2 and for for New Zealand? This is very exciting. The impact?
So we've got such a complementary skill set and a shared vision, which makes it the perfect partnership. We're both focused on ensuring that founders who are doing great things have the support that they need. That's it. So this partnership really does represent something that's greater than the sum of its parts and really represents a boost to the deep technology ecosystem. It bridges that gap for founders who have a great idea to not just have access to the facilities and the community that Level2 has, but also the backing of real money behind it, which is what Icehouse Ventures and their investor networks brings in. So it's a complementary partnership that really just amplifies what Level2 and Icehouse Ventures can do for deep technology specifically. So we've now transitioned out of being a commercial laboratory and workshop facility catering specifically to deep tech startups into one that has the depth of capital to support the companies that we really believe in. So this just is a step change in how we can better support founders going forward.
That's great. And so, what do you think the next 5 years will look like, for deep tech in New Zealand, and how much of an increase do you think this will lead to in terms of an impact that Level2 and Icehouse Ventures can have?
I think there's been two things that changed over the last few years that will cause the acceleration of deep technology startups going forward. One of the reasons why deep tech was difficult in New Zealand initially, or over the last few years, is because of the capital requirements of these companies. They're expensive.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly, look, Peter Beck has mentioned on numerous times, right? On numerous occasions, the challenges with raising capital in New Zealand for Rocket Lab, and his continued sort of discussion on that has certainly helped sort of bring some attention to that. But I guess if that was the case for him, it was certainly going to impact others.
Yeah, completely, and that I think is changing. The fact that the government have pulled some clever levers to encourage more capital into this space has been hugely helpful. NZGCP and the 300 million that's behind them hopefully will put more capital into the market to accelerate those companies a little bit further. The reintroduction of the Technology Incubator Program to help publicly funded research institutes commercialize their technology. The the introduction of international investment firms, especially from Australia, looking at New Zealand as a source of deal flow, this is all putting money into the ecosystem that desperately needed it. The second thing is, now that we have seen the successes of Pete and Sean, but also Will from Mint and Sean from Avatana, that expertise is starting to recycle back into the ecosystem. So it was also a question of not having that many examples to look up to, and I think that's changed as well. So I think we're just going to see a boom in these industries going forward.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for the expertise that's gained by people locally working in the firms that over a period of 10 plus years become very successful, and then often out of those firms we see whole new ideas and new businesses and startups. Is that something that you're seeing in deep tech as well?
Very much so. And I don't want to keep coming back to Lanzatech, but they're just such a good example of this. When Lanzatech left New Zealand in 2014, they the ripples that sent through the ecosystem were ones of optimism and enthusiasm and ambition. So 3 companies at Level2 were founded by ex-Lanzatech employees, and there's something to be said for that. If it can be shown that a crazy idea can turn into something quite tangible and quite profitable, it's infectious. So some of the younger companies that we're now seeing come through have either worked for a startup before or have knowledge of the industry and are looking at startup world as their next adventure, which is exactly the kind of thing that we want to be encouraging. Yeah,
that's great. So where to next?
Yeah. This is what we're looking forward to. So with Icehouse Ventures support, we're now able to take another level of the building that we're currently in to up to 3,200 square meters of laboratory and workshop space that we can make available for the early stage ventures that we now back with our $10 million fund. So it really is this combination of bespoke facilities, a supportive community of people who've been there and done that, and the investment that accelerates a deep technology company. So we're expanding all 3 of those. We've got the investment capital behind us, we're expanding our facilities, and we're building out our community, which is happening quite organically. So in addition to that, we're also building out a pre-incubation program called the Launch Lab. So what we've seen over the last few years is this trend of companies on site incubating other companies, because sometimes all you need as a deep tech startup is a little bit of lab space and a little bit of capital just to get going, just to prove that there's some legs to this idea. But that doesn't really scale if you've got companies doing that. So that's what Level2 is now doing with the Launch Lab program. We've got space available for early stage companies who just need some space to tinker and play. So we've got 2 companies piloting that program at the moment. We're hoping to ramp that up to 8 companies a year, which will hopefully give some founders with big ambitions the first sort of foot in the door on this journey.
That's great. And we're in an election cycle at the moment here in New Zealand. So are there any things that are on your mind that we need to be pushing out to politicians and saying, hey, this is something important that should be considered at this time? Yes,
no, we've really appreciated what the government has done over the last few years. Like I mentioned, the Technology Incubator Program, the NZGCP. They've done a lot of work to ensure that the ecosystem is getting to where it needs to be to facilitate this kind of innovation. So just keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah,
it's working so far.
That's good.
I know some people might say that it's not, but it's because this is an industry that takes a bit of patience. So I would also just encourage anyone who's thinking about what this ecosystem needs to think beyond a 3-year period.
Yeah, and I think it's also important not to get too tied up in what governments are and aren't doing, right? Because governments will come and go, and if what you've got is sound, you're going to have to live through varying cycles with any business, any startup.
Yep, that's very true. That's very true.
Yeah. Oh, it's been great to have you on the show, Imche. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Just watch the space.
Excellent.
I think we're also now, because we're scaling the Launch Lab program out quite significantly, we're looking to find those next ideas. So if you've been tinkering in your garage, or you've been working in a lab, or you've got an idea that you just need to test out, like we've got the space and the capital and the community and the mentorship to be able to support that. So I would encourage people to get in touch with Level2 if you do have an idea that needs some funding.
How do they connect with you, Imche?
We've got a presence on LinkedIn. You can email me directly. Can I say my email address here?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's imche@level2.tech, leveltwo.tech.
Excellent. That's great. Well, thank you everybody for listening in to this episode of the New Zealand Tech Podcast. A huge thank you to our show partners who make New Zealand Tech Podcast possible, and of course are themselves huge supporters of technology and innovation in New Zealand. So thank you to Sumo Logic, Vodafone, Spark, Vocus, HP, Samsung, Gorilla Technology, and Umbrella Connect. Well, that's us for this episode. Do make sure you follow us across your favourite social channel. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, of course, and we're available through whatever podcast app you listen to, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or any one of the dozens of other podcast apps. Thanks, everyone. Catch you on the next show. See you next week. Bye.
New Zealand Tech Podcast, the voice of the tech community. Proudly supported by Umbrella Connect.